Argentina is in crisis. No, I'm not referring to the country's economic crisis, higher education crisis, or rioting crisis. I'm not even referring to Argentina's chainsaw-wielding president, who is renowned for his love of austerity, Donald Trump, and sideburns. I mean, just look at those things. He looks like Wolverine, if Wolverine was an economist who started a failed Bon Jovi tribute act and had a humiliating accident while shaving. No, I am referring to football, the one thing, along with steak and providing a refuge for Nazis fleeing Europe, that Argentina has always been very good at. In a recent documentary about the downfall of Chile's national team, which is absolutely mental by the way, I'd highly recommend it, I exposed my extreme ignorance with a throwaway remark about Argentina. I was making reference to President Javier Milei's plans to privatize football in Argentina, something which has had catastrophic consequences in Chile, and I said that you would have to be pretty daft as the president of a country that won the last World Cup and the last two Copa América to think that implementing radical reforms which mirrored a failed experiment elsewhere on the continent was a good idea. That much is still true, as we will come on to, but as was pointed out to me in the comments by several Argentine subscribers, for all of the country's success on the international stage, that masks what are not just some pretty serious problems when it comes to domestic football in Argentina, but actually a completely broken system which is at risk of total collapse. That piqued my interest, to be honest with you, so over the last 2 months, in between buying Christmas presents and being struck down by norovirus, I have been familiarising myself with football in Argentina, and I've got to tell you, I am still no closer to making any sense of it. The Apertura and Clausura system can often appear confusing to European audiences, but the arbitrary format changes, expansions, relegation, suspensions, and new competitions in Argentina has led to an ongoing joke among locals, when asked to explain how the country's league system works, that no one knows. And they're only half joking. That is before you get into the power battles at the top of Argentine football between the Argentine Football Association, club presidents, and the literal president. Yes, the one with the funny sideburns. One thing which no one is confused or in any doubt about though by contrast, is that domestic football in Argentina is in steep decline, Primera Division clubs are falling further and further behind their Brasileiro rivals, and a toxic combination of corruption and incompetence has been allowed to fester for far too long. In 2015, less than 10 years ago, the IFFHS ranked Argentina's Primera Division as the 4th best league in the world. In Opta Sports' 2024 power rankings, it ranked 11th, below Major League Soccer and the Championship, which is the second tier of English football, and only one place above the Danish Superliga. For a football-obsessed nation of almost 50 million people, steeped in glory and tradition, and home to some of football's greatest institutions, it is a national humiliation, and one that threatens to get worse before it improves. So in today's video, I'm going to right the wrong of my throwaway remarks a couple of months ago, and take a deep dive into simultaneously one of the most successful, but also one of the most dysfunctional footballing nations on the planet. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Argentina, the birthplace of Lionel Messi, Diego Maradona, and Pope Francis, who is a big San Lorenzo fan. Genuinely. Surprising that it's not the Saints, to be honest, isn't it? As we take a look at Argentina's extraordinary international success, amidst a backdrop of sheer chaos, the rapid demise of what was once one of the world's best leagues, and a football association in almost total disarray. When I tell you that the Argentine Primera Division is confusing, I must emphasise that I don't mean confusing like the new Champions League format, I mean confusing like quantum mechanics. There are people who have dropped out of courses studying domestic football in Argentina at university, switching to medicine with a specialisation in neurosurgery because they just wanted an easy life. In the Premier League, there are 380 matches every season, as each team faces each other twice, once at home and once away, in a round-robin format, to determine the final league standings. That has been the case since the 1995-96 season, and before that, it was the exact same system. There were just 22 teams and therefore 462 matches, rather than 20 and 380. That is the norm throughout much of the world. but not in Argentina. In fact, just to give you some idea, not only of how irregular the Argentine Primera Division format is, but how unstable and incredibly volatile it is, and how the format has been bodged and changed upon arbitrary whims from season to season, for more than a decade, there wasn't once the same number of matches in consecutive Argentine Primera Division seasons. So, in the 2013 season, there were 383 matches, in 2014, there were 190 matches, then in 2015, there were 468, just a slight increase there, of 146%, as the league expanded from 20 to 30 teams, among other things. In 2016, there were 242, followed by 450, 378, 325, 276, 325 again, hurrah, and 378. We will get into the why, but in some instances, I must just warn you in advance, there really is no logical explanation. In the 2019-20 season, relegation from the Argentine Primera Division was suspended until 2022, with the economic impact and overall disruption caused by COVID-19 cited as the justification. As far as many Argentines were concerned, the real reason was to safeguard the country's biggest clubs from the threat of relegation. You may recall that back in 2011, River Plate, one of Argentina's two biggest and most successful clubs along with Boca Juniors, were relegated from the Primera Division. It sent shockwaves through Argentine, South American, and indeed much of world football, and it wasn't an isolated example. The following year, 16-time Argentine Primera Division champions and record-breaking 7-time Copa Libertadores winners, Club Atlético Independiente, making them the most successful club in South America's equivalent to the Champions League, were also relegated, and just a year after that, Argentinos Juniors, who are also former Primera Division and Libertadores winners, and also the club where Diego Maradona began his career, suffered the same fate. It was the culmination of more than a decade of mismanagement in terms of finance and governance within the upper echelons of Argentine football. During the 2000s, a debt and funding crisis ravaged the Argentine Primera Division. South American football had started to fall behind Europe's leading divisions, particularly economically, during the 1980s and then most notably in the 1990s, but they had managed to remain competitive on a sporting front at least. At the start of the 2000s, one could make a compelling case that Boca Juniors was still the best team in the world. As Libertadores winners, Boca beat the reigning European champions Real Madrid of Roberto Carlos, Luis Figo and Raul in the Intercontinental Cup in Tokyo in November 2000, during a game in which Juan Roman Riquelme dog-walked Claude Makelele for 77 minutes before Vicente Del Bosque put him out of his misery and finally took him off, and Martin Palermo scored 2 goals in the opening 6 minutes of the match. For all of their sporting excellence, behind the scenes though, Argentine clubs were hurting. We often think of the 1995 Bosman ruling, which allowed players to leave clubs freely after their contracts expired, as a primarily European phenomenon. After all, it was a decision made by the European Court of Justice regarding footballers within the European Union, but it arguably had an even bigger impact upon players from Latin America. The Bosman ruling, combined with lucrative European television deals and the creation of the Premier League, accelerated the globalization of football not just in Europe, but beyond. What's more, in 2005, South American football had its own Bosman moment when 2 Uruguayans, Carlos Bueno and Christian Rodriguez, successfully ran down their contracts at Penarol and joined French club PSG. For clubs in Argentina, who were becoming increasingly reliant upon selling their best players to European clubs for decent fees, the risk of losing them for nothing was not only potentially ruinous in of itself, it also gave the players themselves far greater leverage when it came to wage demands and setting the terms of their contracts. Previously, clubs in Argentina held most of the cards. They offered short-term contracts with big sign-on bonuses, but long-term extension options on relatively low salaries, which were extremely favourable to them, knowing that most players had little option but to sign them. Now that had changed. Players could demand longer contracts with greater financial guarantees, they could run down their existing deals and leave for nothing, and especially for those players with or who were able to claim European citizenship, which in Argentina is quite a lot of people, they could join European clubs with far greater ease and at a much earlier age than before. It caused a spike in expenses for Primera Division clubs, a reduction in revenue from player sales, and, over time, a reduction in the quality of the league overall. All of those problems were exacerbated by the global financial crisis in 2008, massive inflation and devaluation of Argentina's peso, and a wave of violence among football hooligans, known in Argentina as barra bravas, literally, fierce group. The global financial crisis hurt Argentine clubs, both directly and indirectly. Already heavily indebted, rising interest rates and a reluctance among banks and financial institutions to lend money caused a debt crisis. Inflation and the collapse of the Argentine peso was inadvertently beneficial to debts owed in pesos, since they were now worth less, but was overall deeply damaging, as it strengthened other currencies against the peso, making it cheaper for foreign clubs to sign players from Argentina, and most notably, Primera Division players are paid in US dollars, while clubs generate much of their revenue in Argentine pesos, so their operating costs exploded almost overnight. And finally, the increasingly violent Barra Bravas gave Argentine football a poor image, while deterring a lot of fans from attending games owing to safety concerns. Since 2012, football hooligans have claimed more than 200 lives in Argentina, making it one of the most dangerous countries to watch football in anywhere in the world. Since 2013, all away supporters have been banned from attending games. That ban, initially taken as an emergency measure, has now been in place for over a decade, and the authorities appear to have little desire to lift it anytime soon. The convergence of all of these headwinds saw the start of the 2009 Primera Division season postponed, as longtime AFA president Julio Grondona tried to give clubs more time to restructure their debts, raise funds, and, most importantly, pay their own players. That was over 15 years ago, and in truth, nothing has improved since then. Many things, in fact, have gotten a whole lot worse. That is how the Primera Division ended up in a state where River Plate and Independiente, two of Argentina's so-called Big Five, could be relegated in successive seasons, along with Argentinos Juniors, who also hold a special place, in the history of Argentine football the season after that. What makes that all the more extraordinary, and the claims that repeatedly suspending relegation is intended to protect the biggest clubs more plausible, is that Argentina's relegation system is already designed to make it harder for the biggest clubs to get relegated. Whereas in other countries, the bottom 2 or 3 clubs in the league table that season are relegated, or maybe one of them goes into a promotion and relegation playoff against teams in the second division, the Primera Division doesn't work like that. Of course it doesn't. That would be far too simple. Instead, relegation, when it isn't suspended, is based upon what is called an averaging system, which takes the total number of points that a team has won over the past 3 seasons, divides it by the total number of games that a team has played over the past 3 seasons, and the resulting 3-season average determines which 3 teams go down. Because Big Five clubs, for example, are less likely to be consistently poor over 3 whole seasons, the averaging system allows them to have 1 or maybe even 2 surprisingly poor seasons, whilst, theoretically, safeguarding them from going down. It also means that, again, theoretically, a minnow could enjoy an extraordinary 2016 Leicester City-style season and still be relegated at the end of the season as national champions, if their 3-year average put them in the bottom 3. That has never happened, but we have seen almost as strange occurrences, like Patronato finishing 17th out of 30 teams in the 2022 season, qualifying for the Copa Libertadores after winning the Copa Argentina, but still being relegated to the Primera Nacional. Meanwhile, Tigre also qualified for the Copa Libertadores after finishing 9th in the 2018-19 season and winning the Copa de la Superliga, but they were relegated owing to their 3-year average. It meant that, somewhat bizarrely, Tigre were relegated to the Primera Nacional in what was, officially, the club's greatest ever season. If you think all of this sounds confusing, then I promise you, the Primera Nacional, Argentina's second tier, which has 38 teams and featured 745 matches in the recently concluded 2024 season, up from 664 in 2023, and just 315 as recently as the 2018-19 season, when there were only 25 teams and the format was completely different, again, I promise you, is a whole lot worse. The 38 Primera Nacional teams are split into two zones of 19 teams each, where they play each team in their zone twice, at home and away. Then they play an additional 2 interzonal matches against a rival team, which was drawn into another zone. Teams from the same city or nearby cities are also paired together and drawn into different zones. Then at the end of the season, there is a tournament involving teams from both of the two zones to determine which 2 teams are promoted and which 3 are relegated. Meanwhile, the 2 regular season zonal groups determine which 15 out of the 38 Primera Nacional teams qualify for the Copa Argentina. Now what, I ask you, is so complicated about any of that? Shall we get into the third tier Torneo Federal A and Primera B Metropolitana? Yeah? Alright, there are 2 of them, split regionally. One has 34 teams, and the other one has 17 teams. It makes perfect sense. Yeah, alright, we'll leave that one for now. As I say, it would be easier to learn string theory. In fact, it might actually be easier to definitively prove or disprove string theory once and for all, and unlike Argentina's Football League pyramid, you won't have to relearn everything in 12 months' time when it all changes yet again. Incidentally, the system of playing additional random games against rivals has also previously been adopted in the Primera Division, and it has been just as chaotic as you might imagine. Until the 2017-18 season, Primera Division clubs played each other once in a single round-robin format, because there are too many teams to play everyone at home and away, but there was time to squeeze in one additional game against each club's supposed biggest rival in a round of fixtures known as the Fecha de Clásicos, or derby fixtures in English. Admittedly, it sounds much more exciting in Spanish. For some clubs, their biggest rivals were pretty easy to determine, but if you think about it in a Premier League context, or whichever league you know best, you can probably soon start to see the problem. Not every club has a definitive main rival, one team's perceived main rival might not be another one's, and some teams don't have any genuinely fierce rivalries to speak of at all. I should know, my own club, Hull City, doesn't really have any proper rivalries. We have Yorkshire derbies, but they are all against clubs like Sheffield United, Sheffield Wednesday, Leeds United or Huddersfield Town, who have bigger rivalries with other clubs, and the teams who may harbour genuine resentment towards us, like Grimsby or Scunthorpe, have been so far below us for so long now that we never really played them, and younger supporters wouldn't consider them rivals. And yes, I did just manage to shoehorn a segment about Hull City's rivals into a video about Argentine football, and no, I won't apologise for it. The point being, determining every club's Fecha de Clásico was, and still is, further down the pyramid where they still do it, an absolute nightmare, and it ended up with some clubs' supposed main rivals having to be drawn out of a hat as if it were a cup game. Presumably, that is the same way that Crystal Palace and Brighton became main rivals. Where was I? Oh yeah, so relegation was suspended in 2014 as the Primera Division expanded to 30 teams. Only 1 team was relegated in 2015 and then 4 in 2016-17. Yeah, don't ask. And then relegation was suspended again, for 2 years this time, supposedly due to COVID in the 2019-20 season, making a return in 2022, when Patronato qualified for the Copa Libertadores but were relegated regardless, based upon their 3-season average. Last season, Arsenal de Sarandi, a club that was co-founded by former Argentine Football Association president Julio Grondona and his brother Hector, inspired by the English club of the same name, were relegated along with Colón de Santa Fe, but midway through this season, the 2024 season, which is just about to conclude, the current AFA president, Claudio Tapia, announced that relegation would be suspended for the 4th time in just 10 years this season. The justification offered up by the AFA and Tapia this time around was that, and you're not quite going to believe this, The league was undergoing yet another format change, and there would be 30 teams in it in 2025, meaning that no one had to be relegated in 2024. Inflation in Argentina is so serious of a problem at this point that even the nation's football leagues seem to keep on inflating every season. It's a real shame because the 2024 season was set to see a new relegation system, whereby 2 teams would be relegated, but this time, one of them based on coefficients, and one of them based on an aggregate league table. The previous system, you see, had been far too straightforward. Some people were beginning to understand it. The decision to suspend relegation this season less than 2 months ago, and therefore less than 2 months before the end of the season, unsurprisingly raised suspicion. The AFA president, Claudio Tapia, has extremely close ties to Barracas Central, who have been bottom of the Primera Division table for most of this season, and at risk of relegation. And when I say that he has extremely close ties to them, if you're not familiar with Argentine football, you're probably not quite prepared to hear just how close. Tapia is a Barracas fan, fair enough. He played for the club as both a sweeper and a striker. In 2001, he became Barracas' club president, and he remained the club's president for the next 18 years. We're not done yet. That means that Tapia, who was controversially elected as AFA president in 2017, spent 2 to 3 years between 2017 and 2020 as both the president of the AFA and the president of Barracas Central. When he finally stepped down as Barracas president in 2020, to focus on being the most senior figure in Argentine football full-time, he was replaced by his own son, Mateus Tapia, who was a failed player at Barracas under Claudio's presidency, but stepped up to replace him as club president in 2020, aged just 24. Another of Tapia's sons, Ivan Tapia, still plays for Barracas. So yeah, quite close ties then. There are fewer conflicts of interest in the issuing of government contracts in Tajikistan. Another club at risk of relegation, when it was announced that relegation would be conveniently suspended, was Independiente Rivadavia, whose club president, Daniel Vila, is a friend and ally of Tapia's and spoke out in support of his recent re-election. Some people suggested that, instead of suspending the exciting and confusing new relegation system, 2 clubs could still have gone down, but 4 clubs, as opposed to 2, could have come up from the Primera Nacional. But then, how would that have helped Barracas or Rivadavia, and do you really want to get in the way of bros helping bros? Where's your solidarity or brotherly love? Especially so close to Christmas. Claudio Tapia isn't the first controversial AFA president. In fact, that statement is a bit like saying that Donald Trump isn't the first male American president. For 35 years, between 1979 and his death in 2014, the Argentine Football Association was led by just one man, Julio Humberto Grondona. Grondona is a giant of Argentine and indeed world football, founding Arsenal Football Club, the Argentine one, not the English one, although it was inspired by the latter, with his brother in the 50s when he was only 25, heading Argentine football for over a third of a century, and becoming the second most senior figure in world football as FIFA's vice president and Sepp Blatter's right-hand man from 1988 until his death in 2014. Grondona was also the chairman of FIFA's hugely influential financial committee. There is a monument to him outside of FIFA's headquarters in Zurich, Switzerland, which is 3 meters tall, and he was the most senior FIFA executive, unlike Blatter, and particularly unusually among figures in the Americas, to come out of the FIFA corruption investigations unscathed. Being dead by 2015 probably helped, in fairness. After Grondona's death, a Swiss banker admitted to paying him millions in bribes. A New York courtroom heard that Grondona had demanded £60 million to support Qatar's World Cup bid. Having been unimpressed by their initial offer, reports leaked details of Swiss bank accounts associated with Grondona containing $30 million and his son, Humberto Grondona Jr., just weeks before his father's death in July 2014, admitted to selling tickets for 2014 World Cup matches, including the final, where Argentina lost against Germany at the Maracanã in Rio. Grondona was also an anti-Semite, once stating, quote, "I do not believe a Jew can ever be a referee at this level. It's hard work and, Jews don't like hard work," end quote, in response to a question about the standards of refereeing in Argentina, and he made no secret of his hatred of the English, despite founding a club that was inspired by an English club, calling them, quote, liars and pirates, owing to their accusations of FIFA corruption. You sure proved them wrong on that account, Julio, and once stating that he would only support England's 2018 World Cup bid if the UK handed the Falkland Islands over to Argentina. Well, that or if they offered you £60 million, I suppose. Incidentally, Grondona actually apologised for his comments about the English, but not about the Jews. Which, arguably was worse, wasn't it? Elected soon after Argentina won the 1978 World Cup, while Argentina was still under a fascist military dictatorship, Grondona was very close to the junta, often being pictured with senior national reorganisation process figures, until the junta fell in 1983, and he wasn't anymore. After Grondona died, he was replaced by Luis Segura, but just 2 years into his term, Segura was charged with aggravated administrative fraud and forced to resign. Rest assured, though, he still sits on the FIFA Council. Thank God for that. I was beginning to worry whether there might be some people on the FIFA Council without fraud charges against them. The 2015 AFA presidential election was a farce. Contested by Segura before his fraud charges and resignation, and the TV personality Marcelo Tinelli, the result of the votes cast by 75 delegates somehow ended up being a 38-38 tie. A statistical impossibility, of course, as it added up to 76 votes. It was such a shambles that FIFA had to intervene. Yeah, that'll help, lads. If there's one thing that they know how to stitch up, it is a voting process. Segura was replaced by current president Claudio Tapia in 2017, who won 40 votes out of 43, pledging that his first act in office would be to seek a reduction of Lionel Messi's 3-month international suspension. Like most of Tapia's promises, that never came to fruition. Under Tapia's watch, the structural problems confronting Argentine football have only gotten worse. The expansion to 30 teams next season is widely treated with derision by football fans, motivated not by any intention to fix the problems facing Argentine football, but because it is a popular move with the clubs and the presidents who elect him, because it gives them more of a cut of TV rights, and therefore extra revenue. It grants them a vote at AFA General Assemblies, and a shot at qualifying for CONMEBOL competitions, including the bloated and more easily accessible Copa Sudamericana, all of which are of course denied to second division teams. That might provide a short-term high for a few extra clubs. The only issue is that as a result of chronic short-termism and mismanagement, Argentine clubs as a whole are becoming less and less competitive in continental competitions as the quality of the league continues to decline. Argentine clubs have won a total of 25 Libertadores, which is the most of any nation. Between 2014 and 2018, Primera Division clubs featured in 4 out of 5 Libertadores finals, and they won 3 of them. But since the first ever Superclásico Libertadores final between Boca Juniors and River Plate in 2018, which was blighted by fan violence, forcing the second leg to be postponed and ultimately played outside of South America entirely and in Madrid, there have only been 2 Libertadores finalists from Argentina in the last 6 seasons, and 0 winners. This season, River Plate were the only Primera Division club to progress beyond the round of 16 stage, and the first time that they came up against Brazilian opposition in the competition, they too were well beaten 3-0 by Atlético Mineiro. Admittedly, Racing Club did manage to win this season's Copa Sudamericana, South America's equivalent to the Europa League, but they were the first Argentine finalists, let alone winners, for 4 seasons, and only the second winners since 2017. Defensor Justicia and Argentinos Juniors, meanwhile, were both eliminated during the group stage, with Defensor suffering a humiliating 3-0 defeat against brilliantly named Bolivian outfit Always Ready, and in this season's Libertadores, likewise, Rosario Central and Estudiantes were both eliminated during the group stage, with Estudiantes finishing bottom of their group, losing against fellow Bolivians the strongest, and Huachipato from Chile. It might seem bizarre that Argentina's national team has enjoyed such emphatic success over the last few years, in spite of the chaos engulfing the AFA and the declining standards of domestic football in Argentina. And in some ways it is. Heck, in 2016, Messi had to bail out the AFA by paying the team's security guards out of his own pocket, and in 2024, 4 players from Argentina's women's team walked out, owing to what they described as humiliating paying conditions. We're not talking about demands for lavish accommodation, first-class travel, or massive bonuses here. They weren't provided with breakfast or lunch during national team training camps, and not only is there no childcare support for players with children, family members were being charged 5,000 pesos to watch women's team's matches. One of the reasons Argentina have been so successful recently, let's not beat around the bush. It is partly just because of Messi and an overall reduction in quality within the international game, particularly from Argentina's perspective, in terms of Brazil underachieving, but it's also because the Primera Division's decline in standards and economic strife has effectively turned it into a feeder league where talented academy graduates are provided with a platform to play men's football from an early age, impress and earn moves abroad, and the rest of the league is comprised increasingly of mediocre players or the odd ageing former star like Edinson Cavani or Gary Medel. The national team's success certainly doesn't owe to a well-run FA or high-quality top flight. There wasn't a single domestic player in Argentina's most recent squad for World Cup qualifiers against Paraguay and Peru, yet there were players who play in the Eredivisie, the Brasileiro, and Major League Soccer. There are more Leicester City players in the Argentina squad these days than there are Primera Division players. As recently as the 2014 World Cup, 10 years ago, in which Argentina reached the final, there were 3 Primera Division players in their squad, and many more on the fringes. There is an old saying among economists that, throughout history, there have only been 4 kinds of economies in the world: advanced, developing, Japan, and Argentina. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. But at some point during the interwar period, things started to go wrong. For the last century, Argentina's economy has been in an almost perpetual state of boom or bust, bumbling from one crisis to the next, owing to political instability, a dogmatic obsession for many years with becoming self-sufficient, and neglecting the nation's agricultural potential. Argentina's right-wing military junta, known as the Last Dictatorship, oversaw chronic inflation and an explosion in foreign debt, from which the country has never fully recovered. In the 21st century, Argentina has already defaulted 3 times in 2005, 2014, and in 2020. It is within that political context that economist and self-styled anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei, whose party, La Libertad Avanza, ranged from the populist right and right-wing libertarianism to far-right tendencies in some quarters, particularly relating to social issues, was elected in 2023, winning 55% of the vote. Milei, whose rhetoric has become more pragmatic in office, particularly in terms of foreign affairs towards countries like China, vowed to slash Argentina's budget and national debt, bring down inflation, and usher in a new era of economic stability and prosperity in Argentina. Argentina's budget has indeed been slashed, down from 44 to just 32% of GDP, the biggest cuts coming to pensions, welfare, and public services, and inflation has come down from 26% last December to just 2.7% in the most recently published figures for October. But that austerity has come at an enormous human cost, and that promise of prosperity remains elusive. For decades, Argentina's poverty rate had hovered consistently above 25%. Not great, but since Milei took office, it has skyrocketed, climbing to almost 53% in 2024. More than half of Argentina's 46 million strong population are now living in poverty, and they are certainly not yet feeling the prosperity that they were promised. What's more, for all of those promises of growth, Argentina's economy is expected to have shrunk by 3% in 2024 according to JP Morgan, and even if a growth forecast of 5.2% in 2025 is achieved, Argentina's economy will still be smaller in 2025 than it was before the pandemic, and smaller, in real terms, than it was before the global financial crisis in 2008. Milei's supporters argue that spending and inflation first had to be brought under control before the good times could roll for Argentina, and they have until 2027 to make good on that promise. Milei is aided by his political opponents, the centrists and Peronists, both being in turmoil, unable to form a unified front against Milei's party, who only actually have a small minority of seats in both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, which means that all of their major policies and reforms have been forced through by executive orders. If you're wondering what any of this has to do with football, well, firstly, as we've hopefully already established, broader socio-economic factors have an enormous impact upon domestic football in Argentina, and that is the same now as it was 10, 20 or 30 years ago. And secondly, Milei's reforms aren't only having an indirect impact upon football, he wants to have a direct impact on them. A Boca Juniors fan, Milei has bemoaned the state of Argentine football, like all Argentines, but he has some simultaneously controversial yet also entirely predictable solutions to the problems facing Argentine football. Milei wants to privatize Argentine football clubs, of course he does, which are currently predominantly member, fan or socio-owned, by creating SADs or SADs, basically, public limited companies open to private and institutional investors. He wants to slash and burn any regulations, and he wants to create a Premier League of the Americas, but with an even more laissez-faire attitude towards capital, if such a thing is even possible. This is a strategy which has been tried, as I covered in a recent video, in Chile, with fairly disastrous consequences. Without wanting to spoil that video for those of you who haven't seen it and might plan to, Chile's players recently showered in their own feces, and not through choice. Tapia and the FA oppose Milei's reforms, as do most clubs and presidents, with a couple of notable exceptions, and a lot of Argentine football fans who, understandably, as bad as things may be now, fear handing their clubs over to the whims of capital. True to form, Milei has ploughed ahead regardless, but he has hit a couple of major obstacles. One of them is the courts in Buenos Aires, which rejected Milei's privatization plans in September, leading to a government appeal which is now heading to the Supreme Court, and the other is the bigwigs at FIFA and Zurich, who take a pretty dim view towards central government wrestling autonomy and control, away from football associations or federations. Except in the Gulf, of course, where they are fine with it, but that's another issue for another time. If Milei and his cronies lean too hard on Tapia and the AFA, as they have already been warned, Argentina runs the risk of a FIFA suspension, which would see Argentine clubs prohibited from competing in FIFA and CONMEBOL competitions, and Argentina's men's and women's national teams being banned from the World Cup and Copa América, as has happened to the likes of Kenya, Nigeria, Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe in recent years, whose governments were also deemed to have overstepped the mark in terms of FA interference. That would be a dangerous game for Milei, with a fragile mandate to engage in, given Argentina's affection for football, and the fact that the national team in their recent success has been one of the country's few success stories, and sources of pride in recent years. Tapia took advantage of that vulnerability by calling an AFA election in October, which he won, securing another term until 2028, 1 year beyond Milei's current presidential term. Milei responded, as he does with all of his critics, by comparing Tapia to Nicolas Maduro and the AFA to Venezuela, with the General Inspection of Justice, a body dependent upon the Ministry of Justice, challenging Tapia's re-election in the courts, but that challenge was rejected in civil court, who upholded Tapia's re-election. There is now a full-scale civil war engulfing Argentine football, with three key figures: Tapia, Milei, and Andres Fassi, a senior opposition figure who has challenged Tapia's authority. Fassi, who is the president of Club Atlético Tierres, was banned for 2 years by the AFA earlier this year after he was accused of threatening a referee in his locker room with a gun. Fassi challenged his suspension, which came just before the all-important convening of AFA delegates to vote on and confirm Tapia's re-election. Tierres, incidentally, are one of only 2 Primera Division clubs to have come out in support of Milei's privatization proposals. The other one is Estudiantes. Argentina legend and Estudiantes president Juan Sebastián Verón has championed an end to what Milei calls, quote, poor socialism in soccer, stating, and I quote, I am pragmatic. I understand that soccer is a business." End quote. Estudiantes have even agreed a provisional deal, dependent upon the privatization reforms receiving approval, to accept a $150 million investment from Foster Gillett, son of former Liverpool co-owner George Gillett. Some of you may recall that Gillett drove Liverpool into massive amounts of debt, mediocrity, and, the verge of outright bankruptcy before being driven out, and replaced by Fenway Sports Group. If the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, one fears for Estudiantes if privatization is approved. All the while, the formatting madness of Argentine football ensues. Oh, you thought you were beginning to grasp it? Well, I'm afraid you have to think again. In 2025, the AFA announced in the same assembly that they annulled relegation that the upcoming season will be divided into two parts, but not the traditional Apertura and Clausura format that is common in South America, and everyone understands, but into two distinct championships. Firstly, the Copa de la Liga Profesional, officially the Copa Diego Armando Maradona, but the AFA are a little bit reluctant to use that name until the Maradona family have settled disputes around the Maradona brand following his death, which will start just next month, and then the Primera Division with its expanded 30-team format. The Copa de la Liga Profesional was created in 2020, but its format has already changed a couple of times because, of course it has. Argentine football is blighted by corruption, self-interest, and incompetence. It is one of the few things that appears to be less stable than the country's political and economic settlement, and it is now, ironically, and pretty unhelpfully, being used as a political football, ensuring that chaos is unlikely to come to an end anytime soon. The only guarantee in Argentine football is that the next season will be different to the last, and not in a, wow, isn't this exciting and unpredictable kind of way, but in a, what's this? When did they bring this in? I don't understand how this works at all, but it seems really stupid kind of way. And yet, average attendances in the Primera Division last season were still over 35,000, higher than Serie A, La Liga, and the Brasileiro. What Argentine football lacks in stability and, common sense, it makes up for in passion, colour and numbers, but as the last decade has shown, that won't make up for the worst excesses of corruption and incompetence, and if the next decade is the same, or is even accelerated by ill-conceived ideological reforms, it is worrying to imagine what state Argentine football could end up in. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it or found it informative. There was loads more that I wanted to get in there, but I'm aware it is quite long, maybe. It's a topic I could revisit in the future. We shall see. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you are subscribed, not just for this channel, why stop there, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and now Blue Sky, I think it's called. All of those links should be down in the video description, along with a whole lot more good stuff. And have a brilliant day, I hope. Bye.